And so I'm going to present on the Surveys of Enacted Curriculum, which is a descriptive and diagnosis tool for instructional alignment. And this tool actually has strong connections with what Michelle has just been talking about, the diagnosis tool. I'll also quickly mention that RISE will be publishing a toolkit for implementing SEC studies in low and middle income countries. And this also comes from the experiences that we've had conducting SEC studies. So for this presentation, a specific request is that you may find some text-heavy slides. Please ignore them and just stay with me. So this is the brief outline of the presentation, beginning from instructional alignment, and then going into the approach itself, and then briefly talking about the studies that we have conducted, and then how the processing, analysis, and reporting on SEC studies happens, and then a quick snapshot of some of the findings. So this is an example of a text-heavy slide, but it's just showing us where the tool is on the RISE website. So let's begin from here. So instructional alignment is obviously important for learning, and let's highlight like two important angles to this. So we learn from the structured pedagogy literature. Some of the lessons we learn from that relate to need for good alignment between the instructional components, such as the syllabus standards, the textbooks that are being used in the classrooms, instructional support materials, but also teacher resources that are being used to support the teachers prepare for class and the coaching that they do get. But also another angle to this, which is the second angle, lessons coming from teaching at the right level and curriculum of ambitiousness literature. So we also see there that it's very important to align instructional components with students' levels of learning in order to improve learning. So I'll be referring in most of this presentation to these three instructional components, the curriculum standards, the teaching that happens in the classroom, and then the learning assessments. And as you may see, all the players in these three different players may have several roles, and it's important for those roles or responsibilities to be well aligned with each other, but also aligned with learning or for learning. I want to dwell so much on the 5x4 since Michelle has just been talking about this. But I'll go back to briefly what I just talked about 2 slides ago. So instructional components may be misaligned with each other, but they may also be misaligned with learning itself, as I mentioned earlier. So an example here for misaligning with each other could be coming from goals that are conflicting between different players. Let's talk about an assessment body and the curriculum body, or poor coordination between the different players. But also it could be coming from overambitiousness, as I already mentioned earlier. So we may be familiar with the textbook case in Kenya, where textbooks were making sense for only a few children and the others could not make sense of those textbooks. So the point that the SEC is trying to address is how do you measure the misalignment? So I introduced the Surveys of Enacted Curriculum here as an approach to curriculum analysis and reporting that quantifies the content that is embedded in an instructional component. So by quantifying the content that is embedded in that instructional component and the other different instructional components, then we are able to compare that quantification between different components and see to what extent the content is well aligned with each other. So 3 main things that happen with SEC studies, content analysis, which I've just been talking about, between the content within the different components, how similar or how dissimilar. And then performance analysis, which relates to examining the item level performance of students on those particular, let's say if we're talking about curriculum standards or syllabus, their learning objectives, and then Children will be assessed on those learning objectives and how they perform on items on each of those learning objectives. You can analyze that and relate them to the alignment that is between the components. We've done SEC studies in developing countries from early in 2016 in East Africa, led by Taweza East Africa, in Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania. And we did a study in South Asia, in Nepal, in 2021, 22. And very recently, we've done a study in Nigeria. We are finalizing with that study, actually. So there are some key steps in conducting SEC studies, but as I mentioned earlier, there's a toolkit that is coming out next month. So I'll encourage us to look at that toolkit. It goes into the in-depth of how to conduct an SEC studies. But clearly important is to develop or adapt some tools that you use for the study, then compose and train a panel of subject experts who are going to do the coding and rating of the content in those instructional components, and then conduct curriculum content analysis, and then survey teachers' classroom instruction, what they report on, what they teach in the classroom, and then do data entry, processing, analysis, and reporting. So this is an example of a taxonomy, which is a detailed coding system that has to be developed from the very beginning. So what learners should know have to be spelled out clearly in terms of topics and subtopics, and give them some codes that are going to be used for the coding work. And then the other aspect is the other side of what should they be able to do. So in this case, we have 5 levels of performance expectations, from memorize, recall, perform, explain, generate, demonstrate understanding, analysis, and the highest level, evaluate and integrate. And this framework really has strong relations with the Bloom's taxonomy and Webb's depth of knowledge, in case you're more familiar with those. So these are examples of some of the instructional components: the curriculum, teaching aids, teacher's guides, the teaching itself, assessments. So those are the kind of components that are going to be coded by the experts. And then for the teachers, we are going to take them through a teacher survey. So we survey them on their content coverage in terms of topics that they covered and the subtopics, and then the levels of performance expectations at which they covered those different content areas. And then once you've done that, you come up with a new data set that is arising from the coding of the experts and also the reporting by the teachers. So here we have codes, subtopic codes, and levels of cognitive demand or performance expectations that they have reported on their work. And you can use this data set to process it through some 4 simple steps and come up with an alignment index that ranges from 0 to 1, but also some other outputs like content maps that we are going to see shortly. So when the alignment is 0, that means that the components that are being compared are completely unrelated, so that's misalignment. And then when it's 1, that means perfect alignment. So this is the key output that comes from SEC studies, is a content map. So this content map is a 3-dimensional map that shows you the content areas, like these are topics on the vertical axis, and these are performance expectations, recall, explain, up to evaluate on the horizontal axis. And then the Z-axis here is shown in terms of different colors, showing the amount of emphasis. So where there is white, it means there's no emphasis at all. And then as you ascend, going up, so this is the highest level of emphasis. It's like climbing on a mountain. So you're crossing different contours, going higher and higher. So once you're able to generate content maps, you'll be able to see now content maps of different instructional components. This is a curriculum. This is teacher classroom practice in terms of content. And then you have an alignment index of 0.62. Then you can begin to talk about to what extent the teaching or is aligned with the intentions of the prescribed content on the curriculum. So all this work is done in Excel using macro-enabled content viewers, and the programming language is Visual Basic for applications. But you'll be able to compare different content maps, and here we even have the performance map. So this one is telling us the extent of performance by the children. So the item level performance is that children depicted when they were assessed. And this is an alignment table that gives you the main alignment, but also the breakdown of those different alignments and explanations of how those alignments are arrived at. So in brief, the studies we've conducted in the developing country context, we've seen some of the highlights of the findings. Misalignments are common. We've seen unsystematic articulation of content across grades, even on the curriculum themselves, but also how teachers are teaching the content. We see teachers focusing mainly on achieving breadth rather than depth, as in cover much content, but not going deep in any specific areas. And we see student performance disparities that clearly show a few students are performing well in certain items or certain content areas where many other children are struggling on those same content areas. And then we see low progression on content. Some of the latest findings we are seeing from our work in Nigeria show low progression in terms of content prescribed for certain classes or content prescribed for grades, progressive grades, being low, as in the content from grade 1 to grade 2, highly similar, showing that there is little progression on the content. And that's it. Thank you.